Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Holliday, Grainger and Alia Shawkat are hard partying animals, but their lifestyle might be catching up to them. For Holliday, Grainger's Laura and Alia Shawkat's Tyler, night after night is just one big party after another as they get drunk and high across the streets of Dublin. But Laura, a struggling writer, begins to have second thoughts about her lifestyle now she's in her 30s, especially when her younger sister Jean, played by Emmy Malloy, who used to party alongside them, is now married and pregnant. When Laura falls for pianist Jim, played by Fra Fee, who is going teetotal as he embarks on a tour, the friendship between Laura and a threatened Tyler starts to go on the rocks. Animals is based on the 2014 book of the same name by Emma Jane Unsworth, which was hailed at the time of its release as being Withnail I for girls because of its frank, uncompromising examination of female relationships. This film adaptation comes from Sophie Hyde. It's her first film in 5 years since the critically acclaimed 52 Tuesdays, and she spent much of her time since then trying to get this project off the ground. She worked extensively with Unsworth on the script, although only the latter is credited for it here. As you would expect for a film based on a screenplay written by the book's original author, it's very faithful to its source material. Yeah, there are some instances from the book which aren't transplanted to the screen, and it's maybe not as squalid in its detail, but overall, the sense of the book is captured here. The most significant change is that they relocated the movie to Dublin. The original book is set in Manchester, which is actually where Holliday Grainger roughly comes from, and she wanted to be a part of this project for a very long time, but they struggled to get financing in the UK for it, and so the money only really arrived once they relocated to Ireland. The film is an Irish-Australian co-production. But while the film is mostly a fairly rigid adaptation of the book, it does feel like it's lacking its energy. I don't think it's going to have quite the same connection as Withnail I, which it clearly wants to be. The characters and animals should be fairly recognisable to most viewers, if maybe embarrassingly so for some, because it's a phase that many people go through, especially in their early 20s. I think once a lot of people reach adulthood, they embrace this hard partying lifestyle of sex, drink and drugs, if only temporarily. It's that last gasp of freedom to push the boundaries of one's body, but also society's expectations to try and get into trouble before life responsibilities means that you can no longer do that. And the characters in Animals have pretty much embraced that as their entire lifestyle. You could almost describe them as deliberately dysfunctional, as embracing the instability by design. They are always trying to kick those things further down the curb, to always keep living their lives in fun without a care in the world. But at the same time, there is also this sense that they are trying to avoid those things very much because they don't want to face them. And that's particularly true of Tyler, an American living in Ireland, and it becomes particularly clear over a handful of scenes that she has absolutely no interest in going back to where she came from, or even paying it any second thought. There is clearly a lot of bitterness there that she's running away from as much as possible through her partying. Even the fact that she has an ocean between them is not enough for her. And so the characters are best described by a line from the movie where they explain that in your 20s you take those things because you want to numb yourself to life, but in your 30s you take them because you want to start feeling something again. They've essentially embraced the partying lifestyle to such an extent that they are the last two standing on the dance floor. Everyone else has moved on with their lives, but that's exactly the way they like it. They want to be alone from the rest of the world to a certain extent. And that's all well and good until the day you wake up and you realise, oh, I've accomplished so little of what I've wanted to do. It's a lonely, scary place. And that's exactly where Laura finds herself. She realises that 10 years have gone by in a flash and she has virtually nothing to show for it. She aspires to be a writer. She wants to write her great novel, but she's only written a handful of pages in that span. She's always been pushing it aside further and further. She'd be more accurately described as a barista by day, partier by night as an occupation than as a writer. And what's worse, she's looking around and seeing the people that she knows settling down, starting families, especially her younger sister, and it triggers this crisis of responsibility in her, where she starts reassessing how much she's actually getting from her lifestyle and whether she's actually getting any satisfaction from it. Is she actually finding happiness at the bottom of a wine glass filled from the dregs of other wine glasses? And Animals is all about that. It's all about the pressures and expectations that life and society places upon us, and especially upon women. The demand to find a man, get married, and start a family. And Tyler is always the first to have a very long speech ready about how their hedonism, how their bad behaviour is countercultural, that they are being transgressive, that they are pushing back together against the traditionalist, archaic stereotypes that are foisted upon women by the patriarchy. They will live their lives as irresponsibly as they can for as long as they can, because it's their lives to lead and they don't give a damn about anything else. And also, they're artists. They are living life to the fullest because it will be represented in their work. Conformity is for everyone else, and that is death. And Laura, to some extent, does sympathise with those arguments, but also she does kind of want those things for herself, and over the course of the film, she does start to rehabilitate herself somewhat, or at least start to get her priorities in order and try to realise her actual ambitions that she's been putting off for so long, and trying to make sense of her life. And that is the thing that this movie ends up being, is that it ends up being essentially a belated coming of age story on her behalf. It's a tale of arrested adulthood, essentially. The best way of describing Animals is that it's set in that hazy space where the high of the night is starting to wear off and the hangover is just starting to kick in. The best thing about the film is easily the chemistry between Shawkat and Grainger, which is simply exceptional. You really do get the sense that these have been best friends for a decade, and that's not just because they share a sense of playfulness together, but they have that in spades. They make for a terrific double act as they run across Dublin causing mayhem, although ironically, the funniest moment in the film actually comes from Jean in a flashback in a gag that's as sacrilegious as it is outrageously hysterical, but it's also because the two of them share a bracing honesty with each other, which makes sense because these two have been through it all. They've seen each other throw up. There is nothing left for them to hide anymore. And so what you have is a real intimacy between these two characters. They are brutal, but also very, very endeared to each other. And as an examination of female friendship, that really does work. These are two characters that life pushed together at a similar point in their lives. They wanted the same thing and have stuck together like glue, but now life is pulling them apart because they want different things, and that's something that they come to realise over the course of the narrative. And Holliday Grainger perhaps has the more challenging role of the two because of course she has to affect an Irish accent, which has defeated many an actor in the past, but I think she gives one of the best I have ever heard. She is fantastic with that accent. I was totally convinced all the time during this film, and maybe that might be different if you're actually from Ireland. Maybe I just don't have the ear for it, but I really do think that she gives a total committed effort over the course of this film, and in general her performance is really great. She has to go through a number of different emotions as this really conflicted character, trying to assess what makes her fulfilled. And I really did like Farfi as Jim, even if I did think overall he was fairly underutilized. It's very easy to see why Laura does fall for him, because let's face it, he's handsome, he's charismatic, he plays the piano for crying out loud. Who wouldn't want that dreamboat, frankly? He seems like the perfect match, and he gets a great introduction in Act 1, but then after that point he only appears intermittently because of course his character's on tour, and I found that to be a real shame because I genuinely liked his performance, and also some of the best scenes in this film come between Fee and Grainger. Some of the most romantic scenes are in there, but also scenes where she's not sure if maybe she's kind of rushed into this a little bit too fast, maybe she's getting a little bit of cold feet about it all. Those are some really interesting scenes, but of course because he's only in a scattering of the movie, the way that relationship ultimately plays out, I feel like it doesn't have quite the resonance it really should have. It does feel like he's more of a supporting player than he really should be, which is ultimately a bit of a disappointment. But if there's one person you'll be coming out of the movie thinking of, it's Alia Shawkat. This is a 100% committed performance that goes for broke and shows just how great of a performer Shawkat is. Tyler is a force of nature. Yes, she's pretentious and a little bit insufferable at times, but she's also incredibly astute, very intelligent, and has an acid tongue. She is very, very witty, and Shawkat embraces that wholeheartedly. She was definitely my favourite thing about this film, and the character is best described as being the devil on Laura's shoulder, always whispering into her ear, well, maybe another drink, maybe another night out. They share this very codependent relationship with each other, but it's also very clear that Tyler is an enabler. Once Jim enters into things, she senses that he's a threat. She realises that the winds of change have come upon them, and she is desperate to keep things the way they are because she doesn't want to face the rest of her life. She is comfortable in this bubble that they have created together. And so she is very cunning and manipulative, and she's trying to push Laura in certain directions that will take her apart from Jim. And so there is that kind of duplicitous side to that character, but you can sort of understand where that comes from. And I do think to a certain extent she does love Laura. She does have a genuine connection to her, and it's a really complex character. Especially once the guard has been taken off, you can really see the vulnerability, especially towards the final scenes of the film. It's a really terrific piece of work from Shawkat that's elevated by Grainger being as terrific as she is. They both work together so well, and they carry this movie on their shoulders. The problem with a movie like this is that when you have characters that are rudderless, there is a trap that you can fall into where you can simply be aimless and directionless if you're not careful, and unfortunately Animals becomes that far too often for my liking, which is a real shame. I know this is supposed to be character driven, it's not supposed to be driven by story, which is admittedly fairly slight, but you really start to feel that over the course of the running time. Animals is at least 15 to 20 minutes too long, in my opinion, and would have greatly benefited from just tightening up. It just, to me, never feels like it kind of finds its own momentum. I always had to force myself to concentrate on the film because it wasn't pulling me in somehow. And Animals is individually great in a lot of ways. There's a lot of really fantastic scenes scattered over the course of the film, but never consecutively so. Those scenes never feel like they build up in any real way. Watching Animals and its pacing is like watching the tide go in and out. It's always rising and flowing, ebbing and flowing, and so those great scenes always dissipate afterwards, and what ends up happening is that you get loads and loads of montages of Laura and Tyler getting up to mischief across Dublin, and these montages just stop the movie cold for me. They're not all that that amusing. It's just the actors just getting into scrapes. There's no sense of progression or evolution over the course of it. It just feels totally interchangeable. You could take one from the beginning of the film, place it later in the narrative, and it would make absolutely no difference to what is going on. And it also feels like they're improvised, which I guess is a credit to the naturalism of it, but apparently they were very heavily workshopped. But I guess that just speaks to the sense of just how scattershot they feel. Just because you're depicting characters that have no sense of discipline doesn't mean you can't have any at the same time. This really needed a stronger editorial hand to guide the film. Just because it's not meant to be driven by story doesn't mean it can't have some sense of narrative. It doesn't have some sense of progression to it. I was always crying over the course of Animals for just something a little bit more structured to it. While I don't think that Animals is wholly successful, I came out of the movie in a fairly introspective mood. If nothing else, it definitely made me think about my own life, my own goals, my own aspirations, my own fulfillment. I may not get up to the bad behaviour that the characters do in this film, but I certainly resonated with their struggles because I'm about the same age as they are. I'm approaching my 30s and I need to ask myself, what exactly do I want? And so on that level, I do think this movie has a genuine audience, and there is a lot to admire about it. I think that the fact that it explores female relationships in a way that I think is genuinely quite fascinating and deep, and has a genuine admiration for its characters, and also boasts two terrific performances from Grainger and Shawkat, I just wish that overall it was a more consistent experience that I could recommend. It definitely feels like this animal could use just a little bit more taming. Animals works mostly because the enormous chemistry between Grainger and Shawkat as debauched best friends, and there is a sense of lived-in playfulness between them, with Grainger accomplishing an excellent Irish accent and Shawkat stealing scenes as the wilder of the pair. The film also has plenty to say about the anxieties of life's responsibilities and avoiding them, particularly how that relates to the pressures that society places upon women, and how friendships can change and fade over time in ways that are humorous but also introspective between the drunken highs. However, the film struggles to find a consistent rhythm, with individually great scenes sandwiched between interchangeable montages of bad behaviour, making for a stop-start structure that would have benefited from tighter pacing. If you like this review, then the party continues over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.